Welcome back to the channel. Today we will be doing a few things to repair the cheapest Gen 3 Viper in the US. The absolute first mod I did for this car, and what I think is probably going to be the best ever, is this. This was like a $7 FM transmitter from my local Walmart, because that is how 2004 cars had to use aux ports. There's no aux port in this car, doesn't have Bluetooth or anything like that. Obviously it's a 2004, it's not exactly new, but I don't really feel like replacing the radio with an aftermarket unit that would give me the Bluetooth connectivity, because I kind of want to keep this car in relatively original condition. At least for now anyway, maybe down the road or something, that's something I can look into, but this enables me to play my own music through the stereo rather than listening to whatever is on the radio. As a side note, which is totally going to start to show my age, this, like I said, is $7 or $8 at my local Walmart. By comparison, the first one of these that I got when the technology first came out was $100 when it was on sale. That is really starting to make me feel old, as it should. No, I just totally missed. I gotta go pull that out now. Now for the second mod we'll be doing, the front rotor on this side is absolutely chewed through. As I showed in the other video, you can see those deep groove marks in it. That's not good. The new brakes that I'll be putting on are delivered. I got new pads and rotors for the front, and I did not go with OEM pads, and I know I just said I'm trying to keep this thing relatively original. I am going with a higher temp rated pad. That way I can do track days, and I know I won't have to worry about the brakes failing. Track days, especially on the course that I like to run, which is Palmer Motorsports Park up here in New England. There's a lot of elevation change, and the front straight, which is kind of like a front curve at the speed you're going, it's pretty quick. In a car like this or on a motorcycle, which is what I also like to do track days in, you get up to something like 140 to 150 miles per hour on that straight. Trying to slow down hard from that speed, you do a lot of wear on your brakes. Same with the frequent downhill sections where gravity's working against you. So having a good, reliable brake setup is kind of a necessity of something like this, especially if you really want to do some spirited driving with it. Enough talking, let's break out the parts and let's get this going.
What you're witnessing here is one of the first times, if not the first time, I've ever jacked up this car. And what I'm quickly finding out here is that not only is my jack not low enough profile, but something that you might not know about the Vipers is that there's little cutouts throughout the car at the jacking points. You're supposed to get this special adapter that fits nicely in those little pockets. Otherwise, the jack head on most jacks that are like commercially available, like anything that you and I can buy, those heads are too big to fit in those little cutouts. Therefore, you'll just kind of crush the plastics around the jack point if you try to use a standard jack. So what most people on the forums do, that I figured out, is they put a couple hockey pucks and they fit perfectly in there. They give you enough clearance below that your jack head can pick up those instead. So not only do you need the clearance for the height of the jack, but you need the clearance for the height of the jack plus a couple hockey pucks on top of it. Therefore, I had to make a couple little impromptu ramps with some scrap wood I had lying around just to get this high enough that I could fit the jack with the hockey pucks below the car. Now, removing the wheel and tire, removing the caliper and the caliper bracket, all very straightforward. The one other thing that should have been straightforward, but I just haven't done it before with a setup like this, is removing the brake pads on this setup. So this has a through pin on the top that locks the pads into position. You have to punch those pins out using quite literally a little punch and a hammer. I've just never had a car with this setup before. Mine have always been that you kind of pull the bracket off and then slide the pads in. This is actually a lot faster to change out pads if you know what you're doing with this. So you can actually go pull the wheel off and swap out a set of pads in about 15 minutes at the track. That's especially useful for people who swap out their pads when they get to a track so they don't have to street drive on a really aggressive set, or if they're going through several brake pads over the course of a track day or the track weekend. But just because I wasn't anticipating it, it took me a little bit to figure it out. You see me bolt the caliper back up to try to get a little more leverage and to tap it out. Once I fired up my 3 remaining brain cells, it went a lot smoother. I just hadn't anticipated this, having not seen it before. And in the list of other things I didn't anticipate is I'm not used to working with calipers and rotors this big, so the second I went to put this rotor on, I dropped the caliper, knocked it off of where it was sitting at the top, and chipped the enamel at the bottom. And to this day, I'm still kicking myself over doing that. But other than this superficial damage that I caused to the outside of my calipers, everything else was just compressing the pistons back in to fit the new pads in, because the new pads are a little bit thicker than the old ones, obviously. Then sliding everything back in and just reassembling. Again, very straightforward if you've ever done brakes before. Nothing really too difficult here. At the end of the day, this is a Dodge we're working on, not too bad. Personally, I think that's one of the biggest perks of a Viper versus other budget exotic cars or supercars, is you can work on it yourself. It is very simple mechanically. Now let's take a closer look at this caliper that I just damaged like an idiot.
The first side with the chewed rotor is now done. Here's my nice shiny new rotor, and by comparison, the not shiny rotor. So I went with some centric blanks for the rotor. I went with EBC yellow stuff on the pads. I am, however, really kicking myself right now because I dropped the caliper. I was not holding it properly, and as a result, I chipped the paint here on this leading edge. I'm very not pleased with myself for dropping that and chipping that leading edge on the, it's mostly in those two locations, but I'm still not happy about it. The only somewhat good part is it's probably the least of my worries given how scratched up the rest of this paint looks anyhow, but it's something that I did because I wasn't thinking, so I'm kind of not pleased. Anyhow, I've never had a brake set up like this where you can pull the pin and then the pads come directly out of the back without needing to pull off the caliper. So that is new for me. It took me a little bit to figure it out, as you could see. I'm gonna go ahead and hit the other side as well. Hopefully don't drop the other one as well. And then we'll go from there.
Now everything just gets cleaned up really quickly. We put the wheel back on, and of course it's a 6-lug pattern because the Viper is basically a pickup truck. Once everything is reasonably tightened, get it back onto the ground. If you've never owned a very low car before, make sure the ramps that you needed to get the jack under it initially to raise the car up are there when you lower it. Otherwise, you are going to have a very bad time. But as you see, I move the ramps over to the other side. That way we're set up over there while I'm already moving the car. Then I come back real quick, finish torquing everything down.
One other thing I want to say prior to starting the other side of the car is that these are the pads I took off, and these are actual Brembo pads. You can see there on the back of it says Brembo, and life-wise these actually have quite a bit of meat left on them. So these are brand new pads, and if you don't know how brakes work, this kind of wears down as the brakes go through. This is a consumable, and it literally does wear through to this back plating. When you compare the thickness of these two, however, you'll see that if you put them end to end, there's not much more than about the width of a dime extra material on this, and that is a few miles, but that's not like a substantial difference. When these things are worn out, like really worn out, it is literally down to this backing plate and there's nothing left to it. So these, I would say, were probably put in around 4,000 miles ago, maybe, depending on how hard it was driven. I mean, I've only had it for a couple weeks at this point, so I know I wouldn't have been able to wear them down that much. So I'm actually somewhat concerned that the rotor was chewed up as much as it was with these relatively new pads. I'm wondering if they didn't adjust something right, or if potentially they had a sticking caliper that they didn't address the piston on. Either way, when I was in there today, everything was still moving fairly well, so I don't think any of the caliper pistons were sticking. It'll just be something that I'll have to watch out for. If this rotor also gets chewed, I'll have to probably rebuild or replace the caliper. But enough about that. I'm gonna go get started on the second side now and hopefully get it done a little bit quicker than this first.
Starting by getting the second side jacked up and pulling the wheel off, you'll notice that this side goes a lot faster. So on rare occasion, I do learn from my mistakes in my previous follies. You'll notice I get the pins out pretty much right away and all the hardware out of the way so that I can pull the pads out pretty early. Then I loosen up the caliper itself so I can get into the pads a little easier, simply because I know I have to compress them a little bit more, and for me, I just don't have the tools to do that while everything's installed. It's just easier for me to get the leverage when the caliper isn't installed over the rotor still. So what you're seeing here is actually me trying to pull the pads out with the rotor and everything still in place, and obviously with the caliper still installed over the rotor, but everything including the pins were fairly well seized. They're just caked in there really well, so I'm assuming this set of pads has kind of been in there for probably a few years. I don't think the previous owner really drove it that much. I just think it probably got packed with brake dust and stuff over time and kind of seized up after a few years of storage and or kind of intermittent use like this. And now you'll see, using a ton of extra caution, especially after I dropped the last one, I'm doing everything I can in my power to make sure that this caliper is secured and that there's no risk of me dropping it and chipping another corner. I bolt it back in place briefly to compress the pistons a little bit and get those new pads in place. Then once I get enough clearance, I slide everything off, uninstall the caliper again, and then start installing the new rotor. Naturally though, nothing is as easy as it seems, so I did have to get more clearance. I did not compress the pistons enough. That's what you see me doing here. Is I've got a hardwood block that was approximately the thickness of my rotor, and then I'm trying to stick in like a crowbar just to get that extra leverage to really compress these things. These are not easy to compress. They are literally held in place by hydraulic pressure. All that being said, side 2 was still substantially faster and more smooth than side 1 was overall. Everything's already set to put the wheel back on, get the car back on the ground, and then retorque the lug nuts to spec. And that's going to close out this episode. Thank you guys for watching.